The desperate message. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, on a small, struggling human colony, things were beginning to look hopeless. The colony was located on a barren, forgotten planet, far from the bustling civilizations of the core worlds. It wasn't a rich world, nor was it a powerful one, but it was home to those who sought peace away from the chaotic universe. Life on the planet had always been difficult. The colony's resources were limited, and survival was a daily struggle. However, the inhabitants had made do, relying on each other for support. They had built a small, tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other, and where every day was a new challenge to overcome. But now something far worse than the ordinary struggles of daily life was threatening them. A fierce alien race, known for their savagery, had set their sights on the colony. The invaders came from a planet known as Vokhtar, a harsh world ruled by violence. Their ships were massive, their weapons powerful, and their desire for conquest was insatiable. The humans on the colony had no chance of defending themselves. The alien forces had already attacked nearby colonies, wiping them out without hesitation. Destruction and despair followed them wherever they went. And now, the people of this small human colony were next on the list. There was no military force to stop them, no powerful allies nearby. It was just the small human colony, their families, and the looming threat of annihilation. Among the leaders of the colony was Captain Eleanor Riker, a determined and practical woman. She was the one who had always been the voice of reason, the one who held things together when everything seemed to fall apart. But even she could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. There was no escape. There was no way to fight back. The alien fleet was on its way, and their arrival would signal the end of the colony. In the midst of her despair, Eleanor remembered something. A story she had heard long ago. A story about the deathworlders. The deathworlders were humans who lived on some of the most dangerous and hostile planets in the galaxy. These planets were filled with monsters, constant wars, and deadly environments. Only the toughest humans could survive there. It was said that the deathworlders were some of the most feared warriors in the universe, capable of fighting off entire armies with their advanced technology and brutal strategies. Most people thought of the deathworlders as legends, stories passed down from older generations. No one had seen them in years. They were a mystery, an enigma. But Eleanor knew that in their hands lay the only hope for her colony. With a heavy heart, she made the decision. The colony's communication system, though rudimentary, was still functional. She knew it was a long shot. A message to the deathworlders would be a desperate plea, but it was their only chance. Eleanor stood before the large communications panel, her fingers hovering over the controls. She felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Could she really ask the deathworlders for help? Would they even listen? There was no guarantee that they would care about a small, struggling colony on the edge of the galaxy. But she had no choice. She had to try. Taking a deep breath, she began typing out the message. It was short, direct, and to the point. There was no time for pleasantries. Every word counted. To the deathworlders. We are a small colony, under attack by the Vokhtar. Our defenses are inadequate. We need your help. We are desperate. Please, if you can hear this, send aid. We have no one else to turn to. Our survival depends on your intervention. Once the message was sent, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the screen. She could only hope that someone somewhere would hear the plea and respond. She knew the message was a long shot, but it was the only chance she had left. Time seemed to crawl by as the seconds turned into minutes, then hours. There was no response. The colony continued to prepare for the inevitable assault, each person trying to keep their hope alive while facing the reality of their situation. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the alien ships descending from the sky, their dark silhouettes blotting out the stars. She heard the screams of the people, the explosions, the sounds of destruction. But then, just as she was about to give up, the screen flickered. A message had arrived. Her heart skipped a beat. She rushed to the console, her hands trembling as she opened the message. It was short, just a few words, but it was enough. "We received your plea. Help is on the way." Eleanor couldn't believe it. The deathworlders had heard their call. They were coming. But even as relief washed over her, a new fear began to take root. What kind of help would the deathworlders bring? Would it be enough to stop the Vokhtar? Or would it be too late? As the hours passed, the colonists prepared for whatever was to come. They gathered weapons, fortified their defenses, and braced themselves for the battle ahead. The deathworlders were coming, and with them, a new hope. But no one knew what that would mean for the future of the colony. Would the deathworlders be their salvation, or would their arrival bring destruction instead? Only time would tell. The deathworlders' reputation. Across the galaxy, in the darkest corners of space, where only the toughest dared to go, the deathworlders had earned their legendary status. These were humans who had survived and thrived in the harshest conditions imaginable. They lived on worlds so dangerous, so deadly, that most other species could not even fathom surviving there. Every day was a fight for survival, against predators, violent storms, and environments that would crush an ordinary person in moments. The deathworlders' home planets were a constant struggle, filled with massive creatures, poisonous plants, and deadly landscapes. Yet those who called these worlds home had become something more than human. They were warriors, survivors. They had learned to adapt to their surroundings, mastering the art of combat, survival, and tactics in a way that no one else could. Their ships were fearsome, designed to withstand the toughest battles and carry the most lethal weapons. Their soldiers, hardened by their environments, were relentless in battle, capable of taking on entire fleets and emerging victorious. Yet, despite their fearsome reputation, the deathworlders were a mystery to most. Few had ever seen them, and fewer still had lived to tell the tale. They didn't engage in galactic politics or lend a hand to just anyone. They were solitary, their people scattered across the galaxy, with no formal organization to speak of. Their very existence seemed like a myth, an old story passed down through the generations. But to those few who had encountered them, the deathworlders were not just a myth. They were a living, breathing force of nature. No one knew exactly where they had come from, or why they had chosen to live on such inhospitable worlds. But what was known was that they were capable of unimaginable destruction, and their help, though rare, had saved more than one civilization from the brink of extinction. Captain Riker knew all this, but even she couldn't fully grasp the gravity of what she was asking. She had heard the tales, but they were just that, stories. She had no idea if these legends were true. The message she had sent was an act of pure desperation. What if the deathworlders ignored it? What if they didn't care about a small human colony on the edge of nowhere? But as she sat in her command center, waiting for any sign of hope, she couldn't shake the thought that the deathworlders were the only ones who could save them. The Vokhtar were ruthless, but these warriors were a different breed entirely. As the days stretched on, Eleanor grew more anxious. Her mind wandered to what might happen if the deathworlders didn't respond. She thought about her family, her friends, and the people she had sworn to protect. She thought about the colony's children, the future they might never have. The thought of facing the Vokhtar without help was unbearable. Then, one fateful day, the message came. The comms officer, a young man named Marcus, called out from his station. "Captain, you need to see this." Eleanor rushed over to his side, her heart pounding in her chest. The message was simple, yet it sent a chill down her spine. The words were clear, direct, and almost chilling in their brevity. "We received your plea. Help is on the way." A wave of relief washed over her, but it was quickly followed by a new wave of anxiety. The deathworlders were coming. But what did that mean? Would they arrive in time? What kind of help could they provide? Eleanor had heard the stories, but now she would find out just how true they were. And she knew one thing for certain. The deathworlders' help would come at a cost. They didn't offer their assistance freely. They demanded respect, loyalty, and sometimes, more than anyone could give, But for now, there was a glimmer of hope. The deathworlders were coming, and with them, the possibility of survival. However, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder, what exactly would this help look like? Would the deathworlders be the saviors they had hoped for, or would they bring even more destruction in their wake? As the hours passed, the colony began to prepare. They reinforced their defenses, stocked up on supplies, and readied themselves for the battle ahead. And all the while, the message from the deathworlders echoed in Eleanor's mind. Help is on the way. But she knew that it was far from a guarantee. The deathworlders were coming, but there were still so many unknowns. Would they be able to defeat the Voctor? Or would the colony be caught in the crossfire of something even worse? A reluctant decision. Far from the small, desperate colony, on a planet where death lurked in every corner and survival was an art, the deathworlders lived. It was a world shaped by violence and brutality, a place where only the strongest could endure. Their people had built empires of steel and fire, living in harmony with the chaos that surrounded them. Their ships were like nothing anyone had seen before, capable of decimating entire fleets in a heartbeat. The leader of the deathworlders, General Jax Harlow, was known across the galaxy for his merciless tactics. He had led his people through countless battles, crushing enemies with the precision of a predator hunting its prey. The people who lived on death worlds did not know fear. They didn't need to. They thrived in it. They had made peace with the inevitable chaos around them. But even Jax, the ruthless and unyielding leader, found himself facing an internal battle as he sat in the command center of his flagship. The message had arrived just as he had finished his morning briefing, and it had sent ripples of uncertainty through his hardened mind. It was a simple request, yet it carried weight. Help is on the way. A plea from a small human colony, under siege by a vicious alien species. It wasn't the first time he had received such a request, but there was something different about this one. It spoke of desperation, of a humanity on the brink of extinction. The Voctar, the alien race attacking the colony, were no strangers to the deathworlders. They had crossed paths before, leaving destruction in their wake. And Jax knew that if he ignored this call, the colony would be lost, its people wiped out without a second thought. He sat back in his chair, fingers steepled as he stared at the blinking message on his screen. His crew waited, silent and attentive, knowing their leader would make the decision. But for the first time in a long while, Jax hesitated. There were risks involved. Intervening in this conflict meant exposing his people to a battle that might not concern them. The deathworlders didn't get involved in other races' wars unless they had something to gain. And this colony, while human, had little to offer in terms of resources or strategic value. But there was something else, something that nagged at the back of his mind. A memory, a face from his past. The colony was full of people like the ones he had once known, the ones who fought and died alongside him in the early years of his service. They had all been so young, so full of life and hope. Now it seemed that same hope had found its way into a message that had crossed his desk. The desperate cry for help from people who had no way to fight back. Jax stood, pacing in front of the massive windows of his flagship, his mind wrestling with the choice. Should he respond? Should he risk his people's lives for a colony he had never met, a colony that might not even be worth saving? He had fought countless battles, faced unimaginable odds. But there was something about this moment that felt different. The Voctar were merciless, and they were heading straight for the colony. The colony's only chance of survival was his fleet. The crew waited, some with nervous glances, others knowing what Jax's decision might be. They all knew that if they intervened, there would be no turning back. The deathworlders had a reputation for their brutality, and if they came to fight, they wouldn't just save the colony. They would obliterate the Voctar with a fury that no one could imagine. Finally, Jax made up his mind. He turned to his communications officer, his voice steady, but with an edge of determination. Send a message back. We're on our way. Prepare the fleet. As the officer quickly sent the response, Jax sat back down in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew that this would be no ordinary rescue. The deathworlders didn't just defeat enemies. They'd destroy them. The Vokter would feel the full weight of their wrath, and there would be no mercy. The decision was made, but Jax couldn't help but feel the weight of it pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. The battle ahead would be brutal. But for better or worse, the deathworlders would soon be on their way to face the Vokter in a fight for survival. As the fleet prepared to leave the planet's orbit, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. The Vokter had underestimated the humans on that colony, just as they had underestimated the deathworlders. Soon, they would realize their mistake, unleashing the fleet. The deathworlders' fleet was a force unlike any other. From the moment Jax Harlow had made the decision to help, his entire military apparatus sprang into action. The fleet, known as the Iron Fangs, was one of the most formidable in the galaxy. It consisted of 12 battlecruisers, each equipped with advanced weaponry that could obliterate entire planets if necessary. Alongside the massive ships were hundreds of smaller strike vessels, agile and fast, designed for precise, deadly attacks. The entire fleet was a weapon of war, one built for total destruction, one that would leave no survivors if its commanders willed it. Jax stood at the center of the command deck, watching the fleet's preparations. His crew moved with swift efficiency, checking systems, running diagnostics, and making sure every weapon was primed for combat. They had faced countless enemies, but the Vokter were a different kind of threat. They were savage, unpredictable, and relentless. The deathworlders' strength was in their strategy, in their ability to turn even the most hopeless of situations into victory. But this battle wouldn't be easy. The fleet's ships began to launch from the orbit of their home planet, rising like dragons from the ashes. The sheer force of their takeoff shook the very ground beneath them, the engines roaring with a deep, guttural growl that sent a shiver through anyone within earshot. The dark expanse of space opened before them, an endless void that would soon echo with the sound of battle. As the fleet sped toward the human colony, Jax was lost in thought. He wasn't sure what he expected. The plea for help had been sent in desperation, but he had heard similar cries before. In most cases, his people ignored them, choosing not to get involved unless it directly benefited them. But there was something different about this call. It tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the memory of his own people, the ones who had once fought with him, that drove him to answer. Or perhaps it was simply the understanding that this colony was more than just a distant plea. It was a symbol of what could be lost, what had already been lost across the galaxy to beings like the Vokter. The journey to the colony took several hours, but the time passed in silence. No one on the bridge spoke much, all of them focused on their tasks. The stakes were high, and no one dared break the tension. Finally, the first signs of the colony appeared on the scanners, a small speck against the vastness of space. They had reached it. As Jax looked at the growing image of the planet on the view screen, he felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease. They weren't just coming to help. They were coming to wipe out an enemy. And they would do it with all the wrath of the deathworlders. The crew's final checks were completed, and the battle strategy was confirmed. Jax turned to his second-in-command, Captain Aaron Vos, and nodded. "Prepare the first wave," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We move fast, and we hit hard. No mercy." "Understood, General," Captain Vos replied, her face hard as stone. She had been a part of countless battles, but this one felt different. Something about the Vokter's relentless pursuit of the colony made her uneasy. Still, she had faith in their tactics. Deathworlders never failed when it came to overwhelming force. Back on the colony, Captain Eleanor Riker watched the horizon with bated breath. The countdown had begun. The Vokter fleet was hours away, and there was still no sign of the Deathworlders. She had prepared for the worst, knowing that every minute could be their last. But then, just as she was about to give up hope, the skies above the colony began to darken. It wasn't the usual ominous clouds of a storm, but something far more menacing. There was a deep rumble in the air, as though the heavens themselves were being torn apart. The sound grew louder and louder, and then, with a terrifying roar, the deathworlder fleet appeared, like an unstoppable wave crashing down from the stars. The sight of the ships was overwhelming. They were massive, like great metal beasts, their shapes sleek and deadly. Their engines burned with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavy. The ground trembled as the ships descended, their shadows covering the planet like a dark omen. The people on the colony had never seen anything like this. They had heard stories of the deathworlders, but seeing their power firsthand was an entirely different experience. Eleanor's heart leaped in her chest. Help had arrived, but it wasn't just help. It was a force of nature. She felt the surge of hope, but also fear. The Voktar were about to learn what true war meant. As the deathworlders' fleet prepared to make its descent, Jax stood on the command deck once more, watching as the last of the ships moved into position. The Voktar didn't know it yet, but their fate was sealed. There would be no mercy, no negotiation. It was time to end this war. The first wave of deathworlder ships launched their weapons, and within moments, the sky above the colony erupted into brilliant flames. The Voktar didn't stand a chance. The first clash. The moment the deathworlder's ships entered the atmosphere, the colony knew there was no turning back. It wasn't just the sheer sight of the battlecruisers looming overhead that struck fear into their hearts. It was the sound of their weapons priming, the deep hum of destruction that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. The Voktar were coming, but so were the deathworlders, and this time, the balance of power had shifted. The Voktar fleet, a massive armada of jagged ships designed for ruthless destruction, had already positioned themselves near the outskirts of the colony's orbital zone. They had been prepared to wipe out this insignificant outpost in a matter of hours, expecting little resistance. They were unaware that the deathworlders were on their way, and when they finally saw the fleet coming for them, it was too late. From the moment the first missile from the deathworlder ships ripped through the sky, the Voktar ships reacted. Their weapons fired back with a fury, lighting up the darkness of space in flashes of red and blue. But it was clear to anyone watching, the Voktar were outmatched. The deathworlder ships had no equal. On the ground, Captain Riker watched as the space battle unfolded above them. She had no time to celebrate the arrival of the deathworlders. The Voktar were descending, preparing to land their soldiers, and overwhelm the colony with sheer numbers. She could already see their massive dropships falling toward the surface, their engines blaring as they raced to deploy troops. Get the defenses online. Riker barked to her officers, her eyes never leaving the sky. We need to hold them off until the deathworlders wipe out the rest of their fleet. The colony's defenses were rudimentary at best. They had been designed to keep out smaller raiders, not an assault by the Voktar, and certainly not an invasion by their deadly fleet. But with the deathworlders in the sky, their hopes had risen. The message had been clear. The deathworlders didn't just save, they destroyed. In space, the deathworlders' attack was swift and brutal. The Voktar retaliated with everything they had, firing weapons that could tear apart any normal ship with ease. But the deathworlders had designed their ships to endure what no other fleet could. The first wave of Voktar fire hit their shields, and the impact sent shockwaves through the ships. But the shields held firm, deflecting the incoming projectiles with ease. The deathworlders' battlecruisers barely flinched. With a cold, calculated precision, Jax Harlow ordered the fleet to retaliate. The deathworlders' weapons powered up, and within moments, the Voktar fleet was on the receiving end of a devastating barrage. Energy beams lanced out, cutting through Voktar ships with ease. Explosions lit up the dark sky as the Voktar ships began to disintegrate in front of the human eyes below. First wave complete, Captain Voss reported, watching the battle unfold on the command screen. The Voktar fleet is breaking apart. The reinforcements are coming in hot. Jax nodded. Good. Focus on the dropships now. We need to make sure they don't get through. The deathworlders weren't just aiming to destroy, they were aiming to annihilate. They knew that the Vokter didn't just pose a physical threat, they posed a psychological one as well. Wiping out their reinforcements before they could even touch down would break the invaders' morale. Back on the ground, the first signs of chaos began. The Vokter dropships had successfully touched down in the colony's outer ring, and their soldiers began to flood the surface. They were massive creatures, covered in thick, armored exoskeletons, each armed with weapons designed to tear through human defenses. The ground shook as they advanced. But the humans were ready, or at least they had to be. Riker had ordered her people to prepare for hand-to-hand combat, knowing that the Vokter were not just going to stand still and wait to be shot. They came in waves, fierce and unstoppable. The colonists fired from behind barricades, but the Vokter were fast, their massive forms dodging and weaving through the gunfire with unnatural agility. Eleanor's heart raced as she saw the first line of colonists fall. The Vokter were here. They were fighting back, pushing into their defenses. And just as things seemed like they might break, a massive explosion sent shockwaves through the colony. It wasn't one of their weapons. It was something else. Something bigger. The sky above the colony lit up as a deathworlder strike vessel soared down, dropping from orbit like a comet. It landed with an ear-splitting roar, sending a shockwave across the battlefield. The vessel's doors opened, and out came soldiers, the deathworlders themselves. They were unlike anything the Vokter had ever faced. The deathworlders' armor was sleek and black, designed for speed and agility. Their weapons were built for efficiency and brutality. As they stormed the battlefield, their presence alone seemed to send a ripple through the Vokter ranks. They moved with a purpose, wiping out everything in their path. Their soldiers fought with ruthless precision, cutting down the Vokter like predators in a hunt. "Move, move," Riker shouted to her people, her voice filled with relief. The deathworlders had arrived. In space, the remaining Vokter ships continued to fire, but the deathworlders' ships were closing in, sending out wave after wave of missile strikes. Each one exploded with devastating power, clearing the path for the ground forces. The Vokter fleet was no longer a threat. They had been broken in the skies. And on the ground, the battle had turned in favor of the humans. With the deathworlders' help, they were fighting back, pushing the Vokter forces out of the colony. The first clash was over, but it was just the beginning. The battle had been fierce, and the Vokter were relentless. But the deathworlders had shown their true power. Their intervention had saved the colony. And they weren't done yet. The Vokter would learn soon enough that they had made a grave mistake in challenging the humans. The fight for the colony was far from over, but with the deathworlders by their side, the humans finally had a fighting chance. Turning the tables. The battle had raged for hours, but the tide had finally begun to turn in favor of the humans. On the ground, the deathworlders' soldiers were like a storm unleashed. Their speed, their precision, their raw power, they were forces of nature. Wherever they went, the Vokter's resistance crumbled. Eleanor Riker stood at the center of the battlefield, watching in awe as the deathworlders tore through the Vokter ranks. Their movements were synchronized, every strike a calculated death blow. They fought like one entity, as if they could read each other's minds. Each time a Vokter soldier fell, another deathworlder appeared in the fray, taking their place and continuing the onslaught. It was an overwhelming sight. The Vokter had underestimated the deathworlders. They had thought that sheer numbers and overwhelming force would be enough to conquer the colony. But they hadn't counted on the brutal efficiency of the deathworlders, nor had they expected the humans to fight with such ferocity. The deathworlders' attack was like a wave crashing down on a defenseless shore. And now, the Vokter were the ones being pushed back. Up in space, Jax Harlow watched the unfolding battle with keen eyes. The Vokter had already suffered significant losses in the atmosphere, but they still weren't giving up. The remaining ships continued to fire, desperate to hold their ground. But it was clear that their fate was sealed. The deathworlders had made sure of that. Jax turned to his officers, his voice cold but steady. Let's finish this. Bring the final wave of firepower down on the remaining Vokter forces. Make it quick. Within moments, the final phase of the attack began. The deathworlder ships unleashed a devastating barrage of energy missiles, each one hitting its target with deadly accuracy. The Vokter ships that remained tried to retaliate, but the onslaught was too much. One by one, the Vokter ships exploded into balls of fire, their remnants drifting through space like broken pieces of a shattered dream. The remaining Vokter forces on the ground attempted to regroup, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The deathworlders' ground assault teams cut through them with surgical precision, each strike leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. The Vokter's once proud soldiers were now little more than a scattered, disorganized mess. Eleanor breathed a sigh of relief as she watched the battle unfold. The deathworlders had proven their worth. And then some. With each fallen Vokter soldier, she felt a sense of victory, something she hadn't dared hope for when the invasion began. As the battle neared its climax, Jax Harlow stood in the command center of his flagship, watching the chaos unfold below. His expression remained stoic, even as the last remnants of the Vokter were wiped out. He had led his people through countless battles, but this one felt different. This one had been personal. The Vokter had threatened the very thing he held dear, the survival of humanity. And now he had ensured that their threat was eradicated. The deathworlders' presence had tipped the scales in favor of the humans, and their intervention had not only saved the colony, but also sent a message across the galaxy. The deathworlders were a force to be reckoned with, and no one, not even the most savage alien species, was beyond their reach. But as Jax watched the last of the Vokter ships explode in space, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more was at play. The Vokter weren't the only enemy out there. There were others, more powerful, more dangerous, waiting in the shadows. The deathworlders had proven their strength, but the galaxy was still full of threats. He turned to his second-in-command, Captain Voss. Prepare a report for the Council. This victory is just the beginning. The galaxy will know that the deathworlders have returned. Voss nodded, but her gaze lingered on the view screen, where the colony below was still recovering from the aftermath of the battle. Understood, General. What do you want to do next? Jax's eyes narrowed. We move forward. We don't rest on our laurels. There are still plenty of threats out there, and we're not going to let them think we've forgotten about them. Back on the ground, the humans were beginning to pick up the pieces. The battle was over, but the damage had been done. The colony had suffered losses, but it had also been saved. The deathworlders had done what no one else could have done. They had turned the tide, defeated the Vokter, and ensured the survival of the colony. As Eleanor stood amidst the wreckage, she felt a sense of awe wash over her. The deathworlders had arrived like a force of nature, and they had done exactly what they promised. They had wiped out the Vokter and given the colony a second chance at life. But there was still so much to rebuild, so much to do. She walked over to one of the deathworlder soldiers, who was standing watch over a group of survivors. The soldier, a tall figure clad in black armor, turned to her with a nod of acknowledgement. Captain Riker, he said, his voice low and steady. Your colony is safe. The Vokter have been dealt with. Eleanor nodded, her voice filled with gratitude. We owe you everything. I don't think words can express what this means. The soldier's expression was unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of respect in his eyes. You don't need to thank us. This is what we do. As the last of the Vokter were driven from the colony's surface, and the deathworlders began to make their preparations to leave, Eleanor stood on the steps of the command center, watching them. They had come, saved them, and now they were leaving, just as quickly as they had arrived. She knew that their help had come at a cost. The deathworlders weren't merciful. They were a force of destruction, capable of wiping out entire fleets without breaking a sweat. But in this case, their intervention had been the difference between life and death. They had turned the tables, and the colony had survived. Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that the galaxy had just witnessed a shift in power. The deathworlders had returned, and with them, a new era of human strength and survival. The universe would remember the name of the deathworlders, and they would remember it with fear. The final stand. As the last of the Volkter forces were wiped out, and the skies above the colony cleared, the survivors began to emerge from their shelters, staring in awe at the destruction left behind. The deathworlders' fleet remained in orbit, their ships now hovering over the planet like ominous, watchful guardians. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. The colony had endured, but there was a long road ahead to rebuild what had been lost. Eleanor Riker stood at the center of the command post, her mind racing with thoughts of the future. The fight had been brutal, but it had been won. For now, the Volkter were no longer a threat. But in the back of her mind, there lingered a new fear. The deathworlders had come to save them, but at what cost? The colony had survived, but the price of that survival was still unclear. She walked out onto the steps of the command center, the sunlight now filtering through the smoke and dust from the battlefield. The deathworlders were preparing to leave. Their ships were already primed to depart, their engines humming quietly as they ready for takeoff. It was a chilling sight. These warriors had come without warning, wiped out the invaders, and were now leaving as suddenly as they had arrived. Jax Harlow, the leader of the deathworlders, stood on the ramp of the flagship, watching the humans below with a measured expression. His cold eyes scanned the horizon, as if gauging how much the humans had truly gained from their salvation. He had led his people through countless battles, but this one had been different. The call for help had been genuine, but it had also come with consequences. Eleanor approached him, feeling the weight of the moment. She had no idea what to say. Words felt inadequate in the face of everything that had happened. But she had to say something. There was no way around it. She had to acknowledge what the deathworlders had done for them, even if she couldn't fully understand their methods or their reasons. "General Harlow," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. I can't thank you enough. You saved us. You saved our people." Jax gave a slight nod but said nothing in return. His silence was heavy, as if there was more he wanted to say, or perhaps more he wasn't willing to share. Eleanor had heard stories of the deathworlders, of their ruthlessness, and their utter lack of mercy, but standing before him now, she felt an odd sense of respect for the man who had led them. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or fear, but she knew that whatever it was genuine. "We did what was necessary," Jax finally said, his voice low. "You were in danger. We protected you. Now, it's up to you to rebuild." Eleanor nodded, trying to process his words. "And what happens now? Do you plan to stay?" she asked, her voice cautious. Jax didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to the fleet hovering above, then back to her. "We don't stay. Our business here is done. Your people are strong enough to rebuild now. But don't mistake our absence for indifference. The galaxy is full of threats, and if you need us again, you'll know where to send your call." The words hung in the air like a promise, or perhaps a warning. The deathworlders were not here to stay, but their power was a lingering presence. Eleanor wasn't sure whether she should feel relieved or anxious. She had seen firsthand the devastation they could bring, but she also knew that the deathworlders had been the difference between life and death for her people. Before she could speak again, Jax turned and began walking up the ramp toward his ship. His soldiers followed him, their movements efficient and disciplined. It was clear that they weren't just a fighting force. They were an entity unto themselves, bound by their own code, operating with a level of precision that was both intimidating and awe-inspiring. As Jax disappeared into the ship, the doors closed behind him, and the ramp lifted, sealing the deathworlders away once more. The fleet, now in formation, began its departure, slowly fading into the vastness of space. The humans watched in silence, the weight of their salvation settling upon them. The deathworlders had come. They had wiped out the Volkter, and left a wake of devastation behind. Now, they were gone, leaving the colony in a strange state of recovery. For Eleanor, the battle wasn't truly over. Yes, the Vokter had been defeated, but she had seen the true nature of the universe. It was brutal, unforgiving, and always changing. The deathworlders had come when they were called, but there was no telling when, or if, they would return. There were bigger threats out there, lurking in the dark corners of space, waiting for their opportunity to strike. As the colony began to rebuild, Eleanor knew that they could never be fully safe. The galaxy was a vast and unpredictable place, and they had only survived because of the deathworlders' intervention. But their power was not something to be taken lightly. The humans would have to be ready for whatever came next. Eleanor gazed up at the stars, knowing that the deathworlders' departure wasn't just the end of one battle. It was the beginning of a new reality for her people. They had been saved, yes, but the price of that salvation was the knowledge that survival in this galaxy required more than just strength. It required the ability to adapt, to fight, and to survive against overwhelming odds. The deathworlders had shown them what true power looked like, and now the humans would have to decide whether to rise to that challenge or risk being lost in the vastness of the galaxy.